Up.
Perfect, thank you. And we are going to record this. So Malia, you've got
All right,
that?
thank you. All right, so as Jen mentioned, I'm Jennifer Schopf. I'm currently at the Texas Advanced Computing Center at UT Austin. EPOC is a joint project between TACC and ESNet. We used to, when I was at IU, it was being led by IU, but it's shifted over. Which has had very little effect, except we've got some different email addresses that we're still getting up and running. We've worked with many members of the quilt community in the past as you've looked at the CC star solicitation in former variances. So this is just really an update on where things are and what we're doing. What I'm going to walk through today, and the various cat pictures shows you this is an important slide. This is something Jason taught me. I'm going to do a 2-minute overview of what EPOC is. We're going to walk through how this year's CC Star program is a little bit different than the last few. And then I'm going to talk about how we support these submissions. There's a bunch of places to get more information as well that are going to be popped up here sporadically. One thing that Jason and I really want to emphasize is that any of our comments are just our comments. If you've got a serious question, you need to ask the NSF program officers. They are your best resource for the solicitation questions. They are the final arbiters. What we're telling you is our opinion and our experience. And so, you get what you pay for here. We are not in any way trying to overtake what the NSF program officers do, because they have a very, very hard job. We're just telling you what we've seen in the past. So EPOC, the Engagement Performance Operations Center, joint project between TACC and ESNet, was actually funded in the CC Star program several years ago. The goal here is that we work with people to look at the performance that you're getting on the system between sites, basically data movement between sites. And we do that jointly with our regional infrastructure and science communities that span the NSF, DOE, and actually NIH continuum as well. Quilt has been a partner since the beginning. We do this because today's science is collaborative science, right? You've got multiple partners and multiple data movement. If you share data better, you ask better questions. EPOC supports 6 main focus areas. Roadside assistance and consulting, which I'll talk about in one more slide. We do something called deep dives, where we work with institutions that understand the science and IT use cases and help people look forward. We do network analysis using a tool called NetSage. We've got something called the Data Mobility Exhibition, or the Data Mobility Portal, which lets you do really great baseline testing. We suggest that an institution with a solid 10 gig connection should be able to move a terabyte in an hour. Willing to bet if you try this, you can't. We have services in a box, so DMZ in a box, test point in a box, and we do a lot of training. All of this is available off of epoc.global if you go to that website. A lot of really good materials we've collected over time. The roadside assistance and consulting part is really one of the most outward facing and reactive pieces that we have. It came out, that we do a lot of car analogies within EPOC. Think of this as your AAA. You're driving along the road, you're not sure even what state you're in, something bad happens with your car, you need some help. If you're moving data, you don't know if it's your end, their end, something in the middle. EPOC can help you figure this out. Basically, it's an Ask Me Anything. You send mail to EPOC at TACC Texas CDU, and we respond with questions, comments, and a path forward. So EPOC in 2 minutes. I think I made it just under 2 minutes. Okay. CC Star program, which is what you're all here for. The new solicitation 23-526. It is different than the one in 2022, which had 2 sections. It's different than the one in 2021. Every version of this changes and updates. One of the things we tell everybody is read the whole solicitation, even the boring, what you think of as boilerplate in the back, because this solicitation actually has requirements very far in. So like page 22, there are more requirements for some of the pieces. If you have a question, Kevin Thompson and Deep Madi are the 2 main program officers working with this solicitation. They list several others, including someone from EPSCoR this year. So if you're from an EPSCoR state, that's something to consider in terms of reaching out. All of this is what's in the solicitation. There were some significant changes this year. One is that there are 2 deadlines, one in March, which is way sooner than you think it is, and one in September, which is really not as far away as you think it is. One of the other big changes is that there are 7 areas. So it basically combines all of the areas from 2021 and 2022 into a single solicitation. The anticipated funding level and number of awards has changed significantly. My math shows this is going to get more money overall, but which pieces are getting funded have shifted. There are changes in the restrictions of who can apply after receiving a prior award. And there is an underlying emphasis on working with EPSCoR, democratization of access to resources, and broadening participation. We've actually seen language along those lines in a number of NSF solicitations over the last 2 years. They have a report called the Missing Millions Report that Alan Blatecki worked on, was the main author of. Highly recommend looking at that, because these are things to think about as you go forward. Even if you are not in an EPSCoR jurisdiction, there's an underlying emphasis across OAC for proposals to talk about how you are democratizing access of resources. There are 7 areas in this solicitation. Here is the list of them. The parens are the last time they were offered. The 2022 solicitation mostly covered compute, both regional and data storage. The prior solicitation in 21 was more the networking aspects that we were used to. Most of the language, if you actually go through and look at the 21 solicitation, most of that language is in this solicitation for those areas, but they're in different orders. I don't think that really matters. But there are enough small changes that I really recommend going through this with a fine-tooth comb, understanding where you're going to fit. So the first thing that we recommend people do is look at the areas and understand which area you're applying for, because they grow and shift, and you want to know the requirements that you're aiming for. There are similarities from every previous version of this. The biggest one being that it's science and education driven requirements. There's an emphasis in this on education driven, being a first-class citizen along with science or research requirements. These really are supposed to be the driving forces behind any infrastructure request. There's an emphasis on partnerships across campus or region. Again, we've seen that before. Each area has a laundry list of requirements. They are not the same requirements for every area. The other thing to be aware of is some areas have a little checklist that may or may not include all of the requirements for that area. So really go through it. Some of the requirements, if you don't include them, your proposal will be rejected without review, which really sucks, because you've just spent all this time working on this, and because you forgot, for example, your campus CI plan, or it didn't upload properly, you will not even get reviews or comments back. Campus CI plan, we've seen this before. Again, this is a needed supplemental document for everything except the planning stages, and a documentation of the partnerships. Again, this is a similarity from before. You have a letter of collaboration. Note that this solicitation lets you put in what we refer to as real letters. So it's not just the boilerplate that's in the GPG. You can actually have a letter that explicitly states how you are working with a partnership. And actually the area 4, the campus compute, they demand that in the letters from your IT staff, your IT collaboration, you talk about how your resources are going to be used. So that's just something to mean by it. Okay. Somebody can read out the chat, because I just noticed there's a chat question, and it was, what do I mean by first-class citizen in science-driven requirements? What I meant was, when we work with smaller schools, they often don't have science drivers. They have education drivers. Perhaps they need additional networking to support a biology class. That's an educational use case, not a science use case. So for example, somebody who's doing sequencing in their lab who may need to share data with researchers. Those are seen as equivalent now, where prior versions of this, maybe education wasn't seen as strong a driver. Maybe that answered the question for Chip.
Yes, thank you.
All right. So those are the super high level differences between the programs and the similarities. The areas are pretty much what they had been in the last 2 years with a little bit of fine tuning. The requirements really going through them to see that. So how can EPOC help you during this? And this will get into some of these areas of note. This is the laundry list that's on the website. In the website, it actually names areas. That's from 2 times ago. Ignore the area names. The biggest one is science drivers. We've seen some really common missteps when people look at science drivers. For example, you'll have a science driver that says, well, you know, what we really need to have our science work better is we need more storage. For example, that's something we hear a lot. You know, in order to do our science, we need additional local storage. But your proposal says, well, we're going to build a DMZ. That mismatch is going to basically can cause issues with your submission, because the science drivers are supposed to say that they need the infrastructure you're proposing. Your science drivers, maybe they do say you need a DTN or a DMZ, you know, so they say, well, we need a DTN. You're going to put a DTN into your proposal. You ask for 100 gig DTN. Your science driver may or may not need 100 gig DTN. And actually, those of you who know me know I'm a bit of a Luddite, but we've actually got some really good documentation on why you may or may not need either 100 gig DTN or 100 gig per sonar node, even though it's the biggest, shiniest thing. Looking at what your science needs and how your science will be improved is more important than doing the biggest, shiniest. The other thing we've seen with science drivers is they can often be too general. Most campuses can say there's someone doing higher D physics, so higher D physics is a science driver for you know, needing better infrastructure. We've seen more luck in submissions when they say things like, you know, Dr. Chris Smith's virus modeling project needs this. With this added infrastructure, Dr. Smith will be able to do this kind of science, which they can't do now, or teach this kind of classroom, which they can't do now. So having the science match in that case. How do you find your science drivers? This can be really challenging, and we do a number of one-on-ones. We can help people directly on this if you send mail to that EPOC at tac.utexas.edu link. We suggest looking at your internal network data and see who's moving large amounts of data on campus, where it's going to and from. If you don't have that, look at the press releases that come out of your institution, or if you have a strategic plan, which almost every institution has a strategic plan, look at who they say are, you know, what are the areas that are being emphasized. If you've got a vice president, vice provost of research, or an office of sponsored research, they may know some of the biggest science drivers. You can look at who's getting grant money. So this top link is for NSF, the bottom link is for NIH. They each have ways to look up your particular institution and who's brought in funding for various timescales. It's not too complicated to figure that out, but you know, it's really important for this solicitation to understand your science drivers, identify them, and to work with them and get them on board. If you've got a NetSage deployment, which many of the Quilt regionals do, you can use NetSage data. So we have an all.netsage.global link. The amount of data we're pulling in right now, that's not super functional for longer term queries right now. This one of this, as we shift things over to TACC, we're going to be adjusting some of that. But many of the regionals have NetSage. So for example, if you're part of GPN, you can go to gpn.netsage.global and look at your campus institution to see the science drivers for there. we de-identified down to a subnet, so you'll need some internal knowledge as well, but it's one place to find this data, and we're happy to work with individuals as needed in this. In fact, we've already got a couple people who have asked us to have phone calls in the next couple weeks about this. Super straightforward. And Jen, if there's an interest, we can always do a general NetSage data session for Quilt members too. Okay, so you've identified your science drivers. The next big thing you'll need to do is look at your data architecture. And when we say data architecture, we really mean your cyber infrastructure architecture. So it's the network, the storage, the compute, the data movement, the whole 9 yards. The missteps we see here, by far the largest one is when somebody finds a vendor partner. Maybe it's someone you've worked with before. Maybe a vendor has approached you and says, hey, we can help you with this grant. We can help you with this solicitation. And a vendor comes up with a solution that they think is best, but may or may not meet your science needs. The worst case of this that we saw, there was actually a particular vendor who had been looking, saw that one of these, you could work with a bunch of smaller schools, and basically refused to even engage us in a conversation of what the science drivers might be. Our first step when we talk about a data architecture review is we say, what's the science you're trying to do? Because the architecture you put in place, for example, for a whole lot of small messages versus a couple really big data transfers, it's not going to be the same hardware. It's not going to be the same solution. It's really important that you have that end-to-end match, and that you really look at the end-to-end path. So for example, having a 100 gig capable perf sonar node in the middle of a network that's only connected at 10 gig, not really going to help anybody out with that piece of hardware. So again, we can help people reason through connecting how will this particular infrastructure be used to what should be used, if that makes sense. We get questions in the past. We've had several questions about security and intrusion detection systems. Many of those will pull in someone from Trusted CI, now overseen by Jim Basney, to have a deeper insight into some of these security connections. Should note, again, this particular solicitation mentions manners and routing security as one of the aspects that they'd like to see in the cyber infrastructure plan, as well as other aspects. So again, going through this with a fine-tooth comb and making sure you're addressing all of that is extremely important. As you design your infrastructure, we ask people to think about how it's used in real life, not just the theoretical, and right-sizing it to the science requests. So what are the typical needs? What are your bursts going to look like? What's on the other end of your data transfer support? What can your campus backbone support now? Where are you going to? This data architecture should fit within the cyber infrastructure plan and the longer term strategic approach to cyber infrastructure that hopefully your institution or your regional is going to take. We often find that several smaller DTNs or smaller perf sonar nodes will work better than a single large DTN or large perf sonar node. And we've actually got some materials that can help back up that argument. If, for example, you're in a situation where your CIO is really pushing to have something that you don't think is going to meet your science needs, we've actually got some some nice experimental results that can show how these things can be used in different settings. All of the proposals are asking for metrics for success. So here's a quote: proposals are encouraged to address end-to-end networking performance and considering metrics of success. One of the things that could be done, so we have this data mobility exhibition, which is basically we have known good endpoints you can run tests against. As I mentioned, we're encouraging people who have a 10 gig setup that they should be able to transfer a terabyte in an hour. That's 2.66 gigabit per second. Should be able to. Most places can't. So really, I personally think a really nice metric of success is, we ran tests against the DME and we're currently getting X. We're going to improve that to Y, which is a terabyte in an hour. And you can actually test over time and show how that's improved, which is really a very straightforward, very simple, very doable metric of success. EPOC also has a Viavi tester, which we loan out. It's got a Pelican case and we can ship it to you and loan it to you to run tests. Sending it to you before our March deadline is going to be a little challenging. Sending it to you afterwards for post-evaluation testing, super easy. Many aspects, many of these areas require some line of measurement and monitoring plan. It might not be called out specifically as a plan in capital P plan, but you need to address measurement and monitoring or use of perf sonar. Simply setting up a perf sonar node is not sufficient to meet the needs of the grant. And it is possible that, you say, well, we're going to have a perf sonar node, but we're not going to be part of any testing mesh. We're not going to use it for ad hoc testing. We're not going to have it open to people for that. I would think twice about going forward with a plan that was that restrictive. EPOC collaborates actively with the perf sonar consortium. We're happy to give advice on where perf sonar nodes could be placed, how you might want to use them, the different setups. We also have some information on use of especially larger perf sonar nodes, again, on the EPOC website. Campus CI plan is a document that many campuses don't have until you actually want to apply for this program. It's required for all areas except the planning grants. There is no standard format for a campus CI plan. And NSF has basically said they are not going to define a common format or elements. However, there are samples available. If you go to fasterdata.es.net, campus CI planning, you can see a list of them from various times. If you've recently received a CC Star Award and would like to share your campus CI plan to folks, you can either redact pieces of it if you need to. We would love to have more samples. Just send it to me or Jason or the EPOC email address. These have been really helpful in people looking at them and kind of adjusting it, including what makes sense. Part of what you need to make sure you do is that whatever you're proposing should kind of somehow address what's in that CI plan. If you have a CI plan saying, oh, we're great and everything's wonderful and functional and 110%, and then you say, in your proposal, well, actually, this is really crummy, people are going to see the two documents and kind of wonder about the mismatch. So it's just important to try to have things be aligned. Depending on where you are in your organization, you may or may not be the person who keeps this campus CI plan. If you need to roll one of these from scratch, we have some advice on that as well. Just get in touch with us because we've seen this happen in a number of different settings. I put a couple changes that I wanted to call out to people here. Oh, wait, there's another chat question. Yes, the slides will be shared as well as this is being recorded. So there were changes in eligibility this time. For campus networking, prior solicitations had said if you've received an award, you can't receive any more. That's been changed to if you've received an award in the last 5 years, you can't receive another one. But if you've received one more than 5 years ago, you can. A similar constraint was added to campus compute. So for those of you who have received an award recently, you can't reapply. And if you do, your proposal just going to get returned without review. The other thing that we get questions about occasionally is what is or isn't allowed in the budget. Specific budget questions, we will refer you to the program officers for detail. At an extremely high level, kind of a blanket statement, these proposals do not allow explicit cost sharing. So some people have applied, for example, to the MRI program where cost sharing is required, where an institution has to say, if we get this award, we'll chip in 20 or 30% in costs in these ways. You cannot do that for these proposals. And in fact, that means that you have to include all of the costs for the project up front. So for example, if you do not include time for the person running the project as part of your budget, there are reviewers who will look at that and say, I don't understand how the project is getting run because there's no time for anyone to run the project. There are requirements at an area by area level that are specific to those areas in a level of detail. So for example, in area 2, it's, these are quotes I've taken out of it. Budgets dominated by non-networking equipment are strongly discouraged. You won't get declined immediately, but strongly discouraged. If you include it, you're not going to review well. It says if you have a data transfer node, it should be less than 15% of the overall budget. If you have a compute resource, that should only be included if it's integral to the DTN platform. My personal experience is if you are starting to have arguments about, well, is that 15%, including overhead or not including overhead, and what does integral mean? You probably want to err on the side of caution for those and kind of lean the other way. Similarly, the regional computing area has constraints on how much you can spend on storage or staffing, and it explicitly says no software licensing fees. I'm not going to say whether I agree or disagree with these constraints, but this is what's in the solicitation. I think one of the challenges is often you have an idea in your head of the project that you want to propose. The challenge can often be mapping that into what the solicitation says it will fund. And a friend of mine who's in the performing arts often says this, you may have written an opera, but they're asking for a country western song. So you need to figure out how to change the rhythm, how to change the language, how to tell the same story in a slightly different venue than you might have in order to meet their requirements. Because if you don't meet their requirements, you won't get any funding. So it doesn't matter what your story is. Lastly, and in some ways most importantly, are the letters of collaboration. EPOC is happy to help with post-award effort for projects. There are certain things that we sign up for, regardless. We're happy to answer questions. We're happy to help you use training materials. We're happy to offer presentations or training as makes sense. We can participate in advisory committees. If you sign us up for other things, that's got to be a larger conversation. This is a good thing to do with any of your collaborators when you call out that you're working with someone, making sure you're all on the same page before a proposal gets submitted will prevent issues of disagreement in the future. When you request a letter of collaboration, either from EPOC or from anyone, generally you can give them a one-page summary, talk about how you see yourself collaborating, and people respond. In the EPOC space, we ask for about a week's notice to be able to turn these around. So with a deadline of March 1st, roll yourself back a week. So that's what, February 21st, we need to hear from you if you'd like a letter of collaboration. If a week before the proposal is coming in, you don't know who your collaborators are, you are not in a good place to submit your proposal. EPOC works with anyone, pretty much anyone. If you can say that you're somehow related to research or education or science in any space, you don't have to be a formal partner. You don't have to have DOE or NSF funding. You don't have to even be US domestic. This doesn't cost anything to you guys. This is what NSF pays us to do. So we're happy to work with you. And in general, timing. When you work on a proposal, it always takes longer than you think. Jen Leisure made a little quip about those of us with proposal deadlines don't really get time off. If you are thinking about the March deadline, you should be thinking about it before January 3rd. You should be trying to figure out at least what your pieces are probably before then. It takes longer to get people's attention than you think. It takes longer to work through the details than you think. Your institution may also have internal deadlines for grant submissions, especially if you're at an institution that doesn't do very many of them, because there's a process and a tedium associated with this that takes time and effort. And again, EPIC asks for at least a week's notice before you need a letter of commitment or an agreement with us, just for our own sanity. Okay, so mentioned cat pictures signify important pages. This one is super important. Everything I've just said comes from our past experience as EPIC. We are not NSF program officers. They are your best source for absolute Bible truth on any of the things I've just stated. If you've got specific questions about budget, talk to a program officer. If you've got specific questions about, is this allowable, ask the NSF program officer. We can give you our opinion, but it is only an opinion. So, because I wanted to leave plenty of room for questions. So EPIC provides a single point of contact. You can find more information on the web. You can get in touch with us either at the generic EPIC website or email address, at me at TACC or Jason at ESNet. All of that will get shared across the entire team. And with that, I will stop sharing. And we can just open this up for questions for anyone who's here.
Thanks, Jen, so much for that overview. Really great information in a brief amount of time, and hitting all those marks in terms of what to be paying attention to as you're going through the solicitation. So we've captured some questions along the way in chat. Feel free to put more in chat or just unmute yourself and ask away. Feel like everybody's still like, oh, the reality of March 1st is yeah, it is a bit overwhelming. I will say it's a lot overwhelming.
Yeah, so March 1st is going to come sooner than you think.
Yeah.
Actually, last time that there were two deadlines, we had been asked a question by folks about, well, is it better to apply for one versus another? It is basically impossible to game the NSF system because there's simply never going to be enough data for you to do that well. If you have a strong collaboration and your proposal is in good shape, go for the March deadline. If it gets to February 20th and you've got a 2-page outline, I would recommend waiting. If, are more people going to go for the second deadline than the first deadline? I don't know. The funding is going to come, just based on when in the year the deadlines are happening. The March deadline ones will probably come out of FY23 funds, and the September deadlines will have to come out of the FY24 funds. Are those amounts going to be different? They could be. They might not be. There is no way to predict. So basically, look at where you are and see how ready you are. It is better to put in a well thought out proposal at a later deadline than a really crummy proposal just to make the March one. The other question we'd gotten in terms of deadlines before was the planning grants, so Area 7. You should not expect, if you put in a planning grant for the March deadline, to have any outcomes for it in time to do a full proposal for the September deadline. That is extremely unlikely. NSF has a concept of dwell time, which is how long a proposal goes between submission to NSF and informing you whether you're accepted or denied. And they try to have 80% of the proposals with an accept deny it within 6 months. That's 80%, 6 months, March to September. So you might know before September that your planning grant was accepted or denied. You might not. So generally we don't encourage people to try to do planning for the early deadline and a full proposal for the late deadline.
Jennifer, this is Chip. Can you talk about the kind of questions you could expect the program officers, from your experience, the kind of questions you can expect the program officers to answer versus, well, why don't you put it in your proposal and find out? Any guidance there on what questions we should reasonably expect an answer for?
So anything related to budget stuff, they will pretty much tell you a yes or no. If you say, is this an allowable expense? Yes or no. They won't tell you whether the number you give them is reasonable or not. So if you say to them, is it okay to spend $250,000 on this piece of gear? They're not going to say, no, your vendor's ripping you off, or wow, that's a great deal. I should tell all of my folks about that. But if you ask, is including the cost for this type of gear acceptable, they'll tell you that. We had a question last time around for a regional that was working with some small campuses, and there was a question whether it was 2 campuses or 1 campus with 2 sites. That was a question we're like, go to NSF with that, and I don't even know, that particular proposal didn't go forward. I don't know if it was because 1 campus with 2 sites was not seen as multiple partners or not. I just never heard the answer of that. But that's the kind of thing that, if you have a question around eligibility, that, NSF will answer. They're not going to tell you, if you say, well, should I go with this piece of gear versus that piece of gear? They're not going to comment on that. And even EPOC, if you come to us with, do we go with vendor A versus vendor B? We'll tell you, here are the attributes to think about. Have you looked at the buffer sizes? Have you looked at the power requirements? Have you, here are the trade-offs to consider, because we don't do vendor specific recommendations. If you come to us and say, what are some switches in this kind of environment you've had good luck with, we can certainly share that. But in general, some of that is just considered, whatever works. I don't know if I've answered your question at all.
No, that's helpful. Your experience is important here, because sometimes, when we've asked a question, it's kind of been, well, submit your proposal and find out. So I think you gave good guidance on budget and applicability, eligibility. Those all seem to be not, is this a good idea?
If you ask Jason or I over an adult beverage, hey, we're thinking about proposing X, what do you think? We might give you a candid, this is Jen talking over a couple beers. Why don't you, maybe try this program instead? Actually, NSF program officers will do some of that. So if you say to them, here's our idea, will it review well under this solicitation, or should we be looking at another one? Occasionally they will recommend another solicitation. That's somewhat a variance also by program officer. As many folks know, I know, so I actually spent time at NSF. I covered Kevin Thompson's programs when he was on his 2-year secondment to DHS. So he and I have had numerous conversations about this, and he is someone who plays those cards very close to the chest and is less likely to give you a straight yes or no answer, and more likely to refer you to specific wording in another document. Your mileage will vary.
Right. Any comments about sustainability? That seems to be a line in every one of these solicitations. And totally understand NSF saying, you know, we don't want this program to succeed for the 2 years we're funding it, and then it just collapses after that. You know, completely understand that.
Sustainability is extremely difficult. Jennifer, speaking as an independent person, can say that while I was at NSF, I argued that the sustainability requirement for many things was not sustainable in itself. There are no great answers. We have come up with no great responses. You know, there are many models out there for how different programs address sustainability. You know, why Globus now costs money to end users is because that was the sustainability model that they had to go by. I was actually formerly an NSF. I was a Globus guy several years before I was an NSF guy. So I know what that internal struggle was like. There are no great answers, and NSF, like everyone else, is you know, looking to folks and trying to figure out what makes sense. Do the best you can, be realistic, you know, look to your institutions for support when you can, is basically the bottom line there. And there aren't, in my personal opinion, there are no great answers to how to you have projects be sustainable. Because if you want something, somebody has to pay for it somewhere. And yeah. Hand wavy. Sorry. Any other questions or comments?
I have another one, but I'm going to wait for other people to interject here.
I'm surprised Deaton's being so quiet. That's not normal even on a Thursday for James.
He's not even unmuting.
Yeah. Nope. If you had another question, Chip, go ahead.
Okay. I should have asked it when I remembered it. Can you talk about you know, where we are on the trend line for compute? You know, is there an HPC in every pot, or you know, we're moving to big regional compute? You could have a big regional compute, but every, you know, a local resource that you can get things set up on before you submit to the, you know, tell us where the trend line is there.
Yeah, well, so, you know, wearing my newly minted TACC hat, I have a little bit of loyalty to say that, you know, there's a lot to be said for the really big compute resources that somebody else runs for you. I think all of these things are pendulums that swing back and forth. Jason and I get a lot of questions about, should we be looking at local clusters versus other resources versus the cloud versus, you know, I think it's really a challenging question, and that everyone's situation is a little bit different. Neither Jason nor I are huge cloud fans, because we've seen the cloud vendors change the rules out from under us more than once. You know, anyone who's gone from all the Google space is free to, oh no, now you have to pay for all of it, knows what I'm talking about. We had actually worked with a group that was looking at uploading almost 3 petabytes of data to the cloud. And, you know, when we did a back of an envelope estimate, we said, okay, that's going to take you over 40 years and then cost your guys millions of dollars to pull it back out. Which were two things that they had never really thought about, because everyone said, well, the cloud is all the data you want is there, so just go ahead and do that. Not saying that the cloud is wrong in every circumstance, but I think that those use cases should be chosen very selectively. You know, I think understanding different solutions in different spaces. You know, one of the things we do within EPOC is right sizing problems to address application needs. You know, really looking at what's going to help the science, you know, not what's the current cool shiny thing. So yeah. And James says can't adjust conflicting obligations. I'm not quite sure what that means, but thank you, James, for weighing in. So any other questions or comments? Jen Leisure has had a technical problem and won't be logging, is trying to log back in, but may not make it. But if we don't have additional questions or comments, I'm gonna share this last slide again. Should you want follow-ups, feel free to reach to me or to Jason or to contact EPOC directly. Jen Leisure will be sharing a link to this recording and the slides with everybody. You know, go forth and be successful. And thank you for your time.
I can't see what you're displaying, Jennifer.
It says it's there. All right, well, I will, right. So I'll put it in the chat, that's me. That's Jason. So I've just put 3 email addresses in the chat window. If you've got questions, highly recommend reading through the entire solicitation and reaching out if you've got questions for EPOC and want some help.
Thank you very much.
Everything.
I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.